Meena, I think we can start. It's 2 minutes. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Gunjan. Very good morning to all of you. First of all, thank you so much for investing your time with us on a Friday morning. My name is Meena Sharma, and I work with the Impact and Engagement team at the George Institute for Global Health. The George Institute is the leading independent global medical research institute in India, with centers across Australia, UK, and China. We are focused on improving lives of millions of people living with non-communicable diseases, especially in the disadvantaged communities. It is my honor to welcome you all in today's panel discussion on patient and public's involvement in clinical trials in India. We all know clinical trials are important tools to generate credible evidence about the safety and benefit of a medical intervention. And it has been increasingly recognized that patients and people should be actively involved in the design, conduct, and dissemination of clinical research. Their participation not only enhances the quality of research, but also the development of equitable healthcare solutions. However, even though in recent years, initiatives have been taken towards this effort, quite often they have remained tokenistic. In today's discussion, therefore, we will look towards our panelists to apprise us on their perspectives, experiences, challenges, barriers, and opportunities in involving and promoting patients and peoples in clinical trial processes. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to humbly introduce our esteemed panelists. Today, we have with us Dr. Bharat Vijay Raghavan, Bharat Kumar Vijay Raghavan, sorry for that. Dr. Kumar is a clinician researcher based at the Department of Critical Care Medicine at Apollo Hospitals in Chennai and an honorary senior fellow at the George Institute for Global Health, India. He has formal training in clinical trial methodology and leads and collaborates on several COVID and non-COVID trials. Our next panelist is Dr. Anant Bhan. Dr. Anant Bhan is a trained medical doctor and an adjunct visiting professor at Yenepoya University. Dr. Bhan is also the former president of the International Association of Bioethics. His work is focused on ethics and equity in health, public health ethics, research ethics, community engagement, ethics of innovative technologies, and ethics trainings for professionals. Currently, he serves as the site PI and lead on various projects at Sangat. We also have with us today Dr. Aparna Mukherjee. Dr. Mukherjee works with the Trials and Projection Unit at the Epidemiology and Communicable Diseases Division, Indian Council of Medical Research, New Delhi. She is leading the clinical trial network launched by the ICMR, the Indian Clinical Trial and Education Network, which is called the INTEND. She has been involved in multiple studies on COVID-19, including a randomized controlled trial on convalescent plasma for COVID-19 and the ongoing National Clinical Registry of COVID-19. And lastly, we are pleased to have with us Ms. DVL Padma Priya. Ms. Priya is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Suno India, an award-winning podcast platform bringing quality audio journalism. She's also the founder of India COVID Survivors Group, a peer support group dedicated for those who have survived COVID, as well as those facing long COVID issues. As a long COVID survivor herself, she has been a relentless patient advocate and continues to raise awareness about long COVID. We welcome you all to the discussion today, and we are very keen to hear from you all. Today's panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Nivedita Devasenapati. Dr. Nivedita is a trained clinical researcher and applied statistics with over 15 years of experience in clinical and public health research. She has been involved in the design and analysis of several multi-center randomized controlled trials in maternal health and cardiovascular disease. Currently, Dr. Nivedita leads the Better Treatment Strategy priority area at the George Institute for Global Health. Welcome, Dr. Nivedita. Now, quickly on some ground rules for the discussion. Number one, please keep your mics muted if you're not speaking. Let us try to be brief in our submissions so that we can listen to all panelists and are able to cover all points in the stipulated limited time. And for any comments, questions, statements, please use the chat box for the audience. Now I would like to pass on the floor to Dr. Nivedita. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Meena, and good morning, everyone, and wish you all a happy International Clinical Trials Day today, and it's an honor to host this session on this special day. So I'll I'll start with a brief presentation just to set the stage, and give me a moment to share my slides. I hope you can see my slides. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes, Nivedita, we can.
Okay, thank you. The clinical trials was something which is a word which was much more commonly used in scientific journals and by clinical researchers until recently, post 2020, in India, it's become more of a layman's term. So as clinical trials moves from the scientific area towards a layman's term, there could be various interpretations of clinical trials. So to set the stage, let me first define what clinical trials are and why they are important. So clinical trials are studies that assess effect of treatments on people, and they are important because they guide researchers, or they help researchers to establish the beneficial effect of a treatment, as well as to detect any unintended harm. They provide robust evidence of benefit and risk to clinicians to choose the best treatment for their patients. And also it informs policymakers to decide allocation of healthcare resources on treatments that may have a significant impact on people's health. So clinical trials are important, and why clinical trials are important? Because they sit on the top of the evidence pyramid. If you can look various levels of evidence, they sit on the top of a evidence pyramid, and there are not they are quite few, but they provide very robust evidence. Now, who are the key? This makes us think, who are the key stakeholders involved in a clinical trial? So the primary stakeholders are the patients and the healthcare providers, because trials are typically conducted in healthcare facilities. Clinical trials are specifically conducted in healthcare facilities. So the primary stakeholders are the participant as well as the healthcare providers. While clinical trials are done at a healthcare facility, there are institutions which are responsible for trial conduct, and they have various committees such as the safety committee, ethics committees, and steering committees, who all are important stakeholders at the institutional level. Beyond institutions, societies also are important stakeholders, because societies, in terms of represented by the regulatory bodies, which is CDSO in India, which is equivalent to the FDA in US, the future patients or the public, policymakers, and the funding agencies. So these are important societal level stakeholders in a clinical trial. While these stakeholders may not play a role in the day-to-day management of trial, they play an important role in the research environment of a country. Now, today's focus is on two people. One is the participant as such, who is participating in a trial, and future patients or public, who are direct or indirect beneficiaries of a clinical trial. Now, we move on to what is patient-public involvement. So first, defining what a public is. Public in this context is our patients, potential patients, carers, and people who use healthcare services, organizations that represent people who use these services. So these are the wider definition of public or a community. And when we say about PPI, or patient public involvement, it's a research being carried out with or by members. So I would like to emphasize with and by, or by, of the public, including patients and carers, rather than for or about them or to them. So this is where we this is where patient public involvement is special, because it is with and by the members of the community. Now, there could be several two-way contribution by the public or the patients, participants. So the first level of contribution is participation. A little higher level is engagement, and the uppermost, the most highest level of contribution by public could be in being involved in trials. So let me give an example for each of these. So when we say participation, this is voluntary participation of a person in a trial or a survey, in a research, in any research. So when we say about engagement, it involves participation of public in debates. It could be dissemination of research findings in ways which is suitable for layperson without scientific jargons. And also it could be raising awareness and social via social media engagement as one of the examples. So these are various ways where people and public can be engaged in research. Finally, when we speak about involvement, involvement means where the public are involved in identifying research priorities. They want to know what they are researched on, or they decide what is to be researched. By being members in steering committees, as I said, these are important technical advisory groups in a trial, or to develop patient-related materials, and sometimes even involved in collecting research data. So these are the various levels of involvement or contribution where public might have. Now, we might ask, why is it so important beyond participation? Why is engagement and involvement is important? As Mena discussed, just taking it further ahead. So the first aspect is it's the moral duty of researchers. So we want to emancipate individuals, remove power imbalances, or it is like they have the right to say what is researched, how it is researched, and also right to know what the findings of the research were. So it's a moral duty of researchers. The second perspective of why we should involve and engage could be for the consequence of involvement. We involve them, people with lived experiences, it increases the relevance of research. They know the best and improve recruitment and better uptake of evidence. So this could be a consequence of involvement, why it might be motivated. Finally, co-production, where we increase the accountability and transparency of research. So since having given these justification, involving and engaging public is the right thing to do, and in the developed world, funders, scientific journals, researchers, even public are moving towards higher levels of contribution by the public in research. So with this, having set the stage of what is patient public involvement and why it is important to involve and engage, I would move to the panelists who are wearing various hats today. And Dr. Bharat, who is an actively practicing clinician, Dr. Bhan with various vast experience, both as a bioethicist as well as a researcher, and Dr. Aparna, who is representing ICMR, and Padma Priya as a community representative. And so welcome all, and thank you very much for participating. And I would just say a disclaimer that patient public involvement is a new area, and so we are looking forward to hear from you and to guide us what could improve. And as we said, this is a panel discussion for the community and public. So we welcome, and we should have some time to answer to the questions which is going to arise from the attendees as well. Thank you very much. I'll now stop sharing my screen. So my first question I would ask Dr. Bharat. So Dr. Bharat, you have participated in several, you have worked in several clinical trials. You've designed, you're coordinating and conducting several trials, both COVID and non-COVID trials. And another important aspect is you are an intensivist. So typically you are dealing with critically ill patients. So can you tell us about what challenges you have faced in recruitment of the patients and in making them participate in clinical trials? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nivedita, and thanks to all the colleagues from George Institute for organizing this and, of course, inviting me to be on this distinguished panel. Happy Clinical Trials Day to everyone. This is really a wonderful event, and I'm very, very glad to be part of it. Dr. Nivedita, before I get into the challenges, is it okay if I elaborate briefly on my role, because that might provide some context to this diverse audience? Thank you. So I basically don two hats. I work 50% of my time as a doctor in the intensive care unit. This essentially means I provide care to patients that are unfortunately sick enough to come to the intensive care unit, either because one or more of their organs are failing or have failed. So that's the reason they would be in an ICU, and the intensive care unit would provide, the necessary monitoring, the sophisticated tools and technologies that are often needed to take care of these patients, a higher intensity and quality of nursing care, among other things. In this role, it's also my responsibility to provide consistently care that is based on scientific principles and good data and evidence. So that is a primary responsibility to me as a clinician. But unfortunately, often there are several uncertainties, like in much of medicine, in critical care, where there are no clear answers and where further research and evidence needs to be generated. So I often deal with issues where there is a knowledge gap, where there is no data to guide us on what is the best way forward. The other hat that I don is I work as a clinical trialist, doing what are called as investigator-initiated clinical trials. Investigator-initiated clinical trials are essentially, to keep it simple, trials that are led by independent researchers and doctors such as myself, and typically do not have an industry or a commercial element in it. And the motivation is to get to the bottom of a scientific question, independent of those influences. In this role, I lead, I design, I participate in clinical trials that seek to answer questions that I face as a clinician taking care of these intensive care patients. So that's the broad context of what I do. In terms of challenges, I think there are several challenges, as this group would know. There are challenges at every level. There are challenges at a regulatory level. There are challenges at an operational level. There are challenges at a funding level, and then there are more patient-facing or those sort of challenges that you face every day in enrolling patients. The overarching concern really in all of this is, for me as a clinician trialist, is to ensure that patients don't get exposed to therapies that are unproven outside the context of a clinical trial. And the pandemic was an excellent illustration of how, unfortunately, across the world, but also specifically in India, patients are often, at the receiving end of therapies that are not proven due to various factors, and we probably won't go into it today. I'll highlight two important challenges in recruitment and then stop there. The first is the challenges that I face when talking to colleagues and clinicians, because they are really an interface before we can even enroll a patient. So any trial that we lead, we need to have buy-in from everybody, which includes all the treating doctors for a particular patient, and also the person under whose care the patient is admitted under. This is perhaps related to awareness, but also other things. But one of the commonest questions I would get when I would approach other colleagues to enroll in clinical trials, and especially for example, if I take the example of the pandemic, I would often be told, you say that you need to enroll in trials because trials are going to give us answers, but what do I do while I'm waiting for information from trials, right? This is a very important question. Like, they have a patient in front of them, they'll say, while we're waiting for your trials to answer questions, what do we do? And it's interesting, but the answer to that is actually enroll in trials, right? You need to enroll in trials to get information faster. You need to enroll, and the classic example is a trial called Recovery, which is one of the trials that gave us the first therapeutic option for COVID-19. So this trial basically demonstrated that steroids help patients with COVID-19 when they're in the hospital and needing oxygen. And this trial gave us answers in 3 months. From the time the trial was conceived to the first result, it was just 3 months. So, the answer is to enroll in trials faster, quicker, in smarter trials, so that they get these answers quickly. And this is often my response to clinicians. They're not always convinced, but that's my, that's the message I try to give them. And if you take 3 months, the pandemic has now been going on for 2.5 years. So if you take the overall timeline of the pandemic, 3 months is not a huge time. And when you take the conventional timeline of clinical trials, 3 months to get a high quality answer is probably the least amount of time it will take. We can obviously innovate, try to make this faster, but we need to enroll patients in trials. That is one reason. The second reason, which of course speaks broadly, is that trials are the best way to know if something works or not, and also the safest way to know if something works or not. This brings me to the patient end of things. So when I approach patients to seek consent. I mean, they're obviously in, they're especially for patients that I deal with, they are sick, and families are, are obviously emotionally in a bad space. And talking about trials and initiating these conversations is always hard. And their question is always, what do I do if I get randomized to the standard arm or to the placebo arm? Why can't I just get the experimental drug? You're saying that, this experimental drug or device is supposed to work. You think there is some logic in why it would work. So why are you not just giving me the drug? Why should we get involved in an experiment? And this is also a hard question. And I think clinicians would relate to this because we often face this question. And the answer again comes to the fact that trials are the best way to know, because if you're giving something experimental, you should give it in an experiment. You should give it in an experiment that is being done well. You should not give it outside of an experiment. You should not give it off label. You should give it in an experiment where, folks have looked at the validity of your scientific questions. There are ethics committees that have looked at it. There is continuous monitoring of the safety profile of the trial. There is an independent group called the Data Safety Monitoring Board that looks at what is going on in the trial, makes sure that patients are not harmed. So the best way to get an experimental drug would be within the context of a trial, especially a well-conducted investigator-initiated trial. So this is, again, an argument that I make, and obviously I break it down to as simpler language as I can, but this is a challenge that we face as well. One last point that I want to make, when they often say that, what do I do if I get randomized to standard care or placebo? I also try to explain to them that standard care is not no care. Standard care is actually providing good quality care, which is backed by the current information that we have. And in the case of COVID, for example, most patients needed supportive care. Less than 5% of patients would end up in intensive care. Less than 10% would need hospitalization. For the most part, they just needed good supportive care. So it was not that standard care was no care. So this is something that I had to constantly, emphasize as well. So these are some broad challenges. There are lots of challenges to talk about, but I will pause here, and I'm very keen, obviously, on learning from everybody on the group. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bharat, for sharing your insights as the challenges you face during recruiting in a clinical trial. So this makes me think, how much do community know about why clinical trials done, and as researchers, what is our role to engage the community for them to be aware of why trials are done at a country level or in a country. So I move my next question to Professor Bhan, who has an experience in engaging with communities, and he's also managed several ethics committees. So what do you think? How much of the scientific language do lay community understand when they are part of ethics committees, and what do you think we as researchers can do about it for them to understand research better or the need for clinical trials? Thank you.
Thank you, Nivedita, for that question. Good morning, everyone. Honor and pleasure to be on the panel. Greetings on International Clinical Trials Day. So as Bharat was already speaking to, first of all, I think we need to all acknowledge that research, including clinical trials, is crucial to the progress of health and medicine as a field. This has been demonstrated, of course, very well during the pandemic, as we've seen a lot of high-quality clinical trials conducted in a relatively short period of time. Even if you just look at vaccines as an example, literally it used to take at least a decade or even more to develop vaccines. We've seen these large clinical studies done with multiple centers involved, a lot of investigators, a lot of participants who agreed to participate at a time when this was not clearly understood in terms of the pandemic and COVID as a disease agent. And we have managed to come out with quite a few vaccines, many of them efficacious, which have helped respond to the pandemic very quickly. So I think we need to first acknowledge and celebrate the role of clinical trials and research in being able to respond to the health challenges. To your question around the role of sort of engaging with communities and lay persons on communities on ethics committees. When you think about the role of a lay person on a community, you have to recognize that they're supposed to be representing the community. Now, what does that exactly mean? One of the aspects that, of course, they have to look at is what is the relevance of science in the way it's being conducted, in the way it has been designed to the community. Is it really responding to the needs of the community or not? And if not, what needs to be changed? Because that is a true role of someone who's representing the community, because they need to engage with the science as well. They're not there to just sit and listen and be pontificated to. It is for them to be encouraged to interact. Now, of course, for that, they need to be empowered, they need to be supported, and they need to be given equal importance as you would give to a clinician or a lawyer or a judge sitting on the ethics committee. So that requires, again, a sense of respect for the expertise which is brought in by a community member. Because I think all of us who are researchers will recognize that lived experience is a form of expertise. It's not just sitting in academic institutions or sitting on funding bodies or being ethicists for that matter that brings you expertise. It's also being members of the community and understanding what those needs are. Now, specifically, some of the issues which come up where that expertise is sought is, how is the research planned out in the community? How are you going to approach the community? How are you going to communicate the importance of the research? If you're using consent, then how is that designed? Is it simple enough? Does it communicate the key points? Does it really tell any potential participant about the potential risks and benefits of participating? It is also important for the community member to be there, because there have been a lot of instances where there's been opposition or there's been misunderstanding of the research which is happening in the community. A very good set of examples of those have been in the HIV field. We've seen those kind of controversies happen with regards to microbicide clinical trials, HIV vaccine clinical trials, where there was a misconception that individuals in the communities were being deliberately infected with HIV by researchers or funders or sponsors. And this was especially true also because these were studies which were often done by international researchers coming into an LMIC setting. So that brings its own power dynamics, as we understand. But only because there was true sort of engagement to some extent with communities was this prevented from becoming an explosive situation, because very quickly can such a situation not only impact the study in question, of course, that those kinds of studies might need to be suspended. Sometimes there is a whole regulatory follow-up which happens, but it could also impact the trust in science. And as researchers, we must always remember that our responsibility also is as representatives of science or the scientific fraternity, and we must maintain that trust in the importance of science, in the importance of research, in the importance of evidence generation. If we lose that, then there is going to be a lot of possibilities that individuals might not be willing to participate in studies, or that there will be a lot of questioning. So even high quality science could be impacted. So the trust which needs to be there is paramount, but that trust also, of course, requires us to be open about what we are doing, open about the fact that not everything will work, open about the fact that there will be risks, open about the fact that there might be adverse events and serious adverse events, and the fact that these need to be responded to, both at the level of the investigator, the institution, as well as the sponsor and the regulator. If that doesn't happen, as has sometimes also been the case during the pandemic, then of course it will impact the way the communities and the public views science and research. Now, specifically on community engagement, this is a field which has grown over the last couple of decades, and the reason for that also is that as more and more studies have been done with larger sets of population, that there has been this whole sort of critical thinking of who gets to decide what science happens. Right? Are these decisions which are driven, say, by funders, or are these funder-driven agendas, or are these really driven by local community needs, public health needs? So Bharat, for example, talked about that there are investigator-initiated studies, right? This is a special classification also in our new drugs and clinical trials rules. But have you ever heard of public-initiated studies? No, right? We don't really have that kind of categorization or characterization of research. And that is partly because science is still driven from institutions and funders. But the way to respond to that, of course, also means that we need to be open to working with communities. And this is, of course, not to be done only from a tokenistic perspective, right? Because you could just say that by having a community advisory board or by having a layperson on a ethics committee, that is what community engagement is about. But I think there's been a lot of, again, churn and thinking around what is the right way to approach it. And hence, there is also a certain science and metrics of community engagement which have happened over the last many years. First of all, we have to acknowledge that it's a process. It takes time. It can fail. Fail meaning that at the end of it, the decision might be that the community does not feel that the research question that you want to explore with the community is the right question, right? It could also mean that the community pushes back and says, it's nice that you're doing this research, but there are other issues of importance which also need to be dealt with. And are you going to respond to those? And this is where the longer term relationships become important. And the one thing that I've seen where there has been these longer sets of relationships between, say, institutions and communities, you've seen also that organic growth of trust. So if you look at the Kanyambadi block, which CMC Vellore has, AIMS Delhi has a whole set of sites in rural Ballabgarh that they have worked with. KEM has the Vadu site, etc. If you look at some of these long-standing research institutions within our own country, you will see that they have had these longer-term relationships with communities, where what you avoid against is this feeling that people are coming in, doing parachute research on us, collecting samples, data, going away, advancing their scientific careers, getting multi-million-dollar contracts or grants to do more research, but what do we get out of it? You know, at the end of the day, in India, we've not even figured out, for example, post-trial benefits in most of our research studies. So I think that's where, if we have these true longer-term relationships with communities where they have a right to question, they have a right to engage, they have a right to co-own the research, then I think we will probably be closer to the idea of community engagement. And that is where this whole idea around involvement, engagement, ownership, and sort of leadership of the science becomes more important. Towards that, I think it's also important for us to think about how can we actually engage with communities so that they can also be leaders in doing their own research studies. And there have been smaller efforts towards this by working with especially marginalized communities in seeing if there is an interest in some of them wanting to understand research, evidence generation, becoming researchers themselves, becoming advocates for research, becoming advocates for the response, for the need for evidence generation, and sort of also recognizing that they can then leverage their rights as research participants and communities in responding to it. Towards the larger issue, I think it's also important for us to talk about public engagement, which is sort of a more umbrella term, which talks about the engagement at the society level. And that is where the role of events like this, that is where the role of media colleagues such as Padma Priya, and sort of talking about the importance of science to society is extremely important. And for that, of course, we should have conversations like we are having today, but also take these into the communities that we work in. So I know, for example, the George Institute does a lot of that in your studies in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, where you have a lot of engagement at the community level. All of us as researchers have to take on that onus of true engagement and longer term relationships. Then only I think it becomes more meaningful. So I'll stop here, but hopefully this will spark up some discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Bhan. Thank you very much for this. I think we are moving from the challenges what a clinician faces to the role of a researcher in addressing those challenges, both for trust and for better recruitment in trials. I would now move to Dr. Aparna. While the researchers have the role, what role do you think funding agencies and research organizations at the national level have in improving the engagement as well as involvement of public in research? So what do you think your role would be, Dr. Aparna, and what challenges do you see? This I ask mainly because in developed countries, there are several initiatives which have been taken up, recognizing the importance of public involvement and engagement. So how do we go about it in India? Thank you.
Right, just as you said, there have been initiatives which have been taken up in Europe, UK or Canada, where they are trying and getting public engagement and their ideas, not only engagement in the form of better participation and trust, but also, as the other panelists said, that in the design and in the question itself. But then that is a process which is never going to have an open overnight. And yes, COVID has brought us this opportunity that this whole idea of clinical trials and research is now something which public kind of understands and may or may not support. But the general fear about clinical trials, that power imbalance, that something is being given and it may or may not work, it may harm us and we are not being told, that might have dissipated to some extent because people have gone through this whole procedure that yes, the scientific developments are happening and they can be tested and they can be brought to the market. So as funders or as sponsors and also as researchers, our responsibility would be as, to actually gradually decrease this whole negative environment, negative idea about clinical trial, that there is something wrong in it. So the more aware we can make the public that this is the way to go, this is how it will actually benefit not only your patient, but also the future patients who might have the same condition. Because altruism is not only limited to the healthcare professional, it also is there on the patient side. If you can actually tell them properly that it may not benefit you, but it will benefit the future patients. That also helps sometimes. So that kind of an advocacy and general awareness should always be there. And we are also trying to have more conversation around this. At present, our grant applications, our publications don't actually ask about public engagements. But yes, this is something which is in the mind of the Indian researchers now, and gradually we will also have that incorporated, so that the investigator who is initiating the research also has a plan in his or her mind that as to how to engage the public and how to disseminate whatever they have provided, biological sample, clinical data. They have a full right to know what happened to it and what were the results, negative, positive, whatever. So, dissemination of that results, not only in the form of a journal, because obviously they are not going to go and access those journals. So they, more of workshops or maybe meetings with the community, and or even personal interaction to actually call them up and tell them the result. That might also help. So these things will gradually come into our grants. We do have these ideas which are not there in the present, but then of course there's a lot of conversation regarding this, and in our network and within our unit, we are trying to have these advocacy measures taken so that the general awareness of clinical trial, what it is and how it is done, and the transparency increases.
Thank you, Dr. Aparna. I think it will be a good incentive for the researcher, but I think at the same time we need to empower our researchers to also learn to engage in community, because it's not a natural skill as researchers we have, nor we are trained in the medical profession to engage and involve people. So I guess we all need to be empowered with that skill. So now I move to to Padma Priya. So, Padma, if you see, the researchers feel we need to be able to engage. We also understand that we are responsible to increase the transparency and credibility, but at the same time, things can't happen from one end. So, as a advocacy expert, what do you think is the role of the society, because research is done for the society? What do you think is the role of a society, and how would journalists like you could play a larger role in removing this negativity, as well as increasing the altruism, the feeling of wanting to contribute to the society? How would what do you think, what advices do you have for the researcher, as well as what do you think you could do for the community? Thank you.
Yeah, firstly, thank you so much for having me, and happy International Clinical Trials Day to everybody. So I'll be speaking wearing two different hats of mine, one as a patient advocate for long COVID and one as a journalist. So I'll start off as being a patient advocate. So I'm a survivor I'm having long COVID for the past, struggling with it for the past almost 2 years now. And and as someone who has been in the public health space reporting on it, I understand the role of research and clinical trials. But I think what happens when you actually want to translate it to the community, to the larger community, is that the fear sort of steps in, and people want to know more. And when you start asking those questions about, but why this drug, or how will it be given to us, or in what formulation, oftentimes they're not given those answers. Oftentimes people are just told, trust us, but now we are at an age and time where forget the power imbalance. There is also a lot of information that is freely available for people. I think we need to start with acknowledging that people are not stupid. The society can actually do their own research, and patients who are living with certain symptoms actually are the best sort of advocates for a certain disease. And I think just starting by acknowledging that will actually go a long way. Secondly, I think very important points were made by Dr. Ban about how you need to have a more patient sort of centric approach even at the design phase. And I think that is really important. If you look at, I'll take the example of long COVID. If you look at how the whole research towards long COVID was driven, it was actually driven by patients themselves. It was patient support groups who came together, designed a trial, put out some evidence out there saying that you need to do research on this. And that's when the collaboration began between patient groups and researchers and institutions. And now there is a lot of research happening on long COVID across the world. And in India, it's just beginning, as we know. And I think that is really, really important. I think it's really important that patients be heard, that patients be trusted, that those who are telling that, hey, after COVID, we are having XYZ, symptoms. Hear us out. Can you go ahead and do a research on this? I think just having those sort of conversations in itself are really useful. For me, the other thing is a communication method or language. I think it's really important during all stages of the clinical trial. And this is something that I have experienced also as someone who worked in the advocacy and communication space. I think you have to, one, remember the patient is not a researcher or an academic, but the patient is going through something which is for them, like, it is very true, it is real, it is part of their reality, right? So you have to almost step into the patient's reality and understand what is happening. And I think this is where patient organizations or peer support groups sort of play a role, because they play like a, in translating this information that you as clinicians or researchers may have into language that can be better understood by the patients themselves. So I think it is really important to have a safe space where a patient can reach out to someone and to voice concerns, and also know that these concerns will be addressed appropriately. So it's almost like you're having like a go between, like a mediator between the patient and the clinician. I think it's really important to think of support groups and think of how do you engage with these patient organizations. And I think a very good example is how like cancer research is advanced. A lot of the time, it is the patient groups which actually do translate this in a way that it's understood for the people, what it means being, an experimental drug being tried on them. Also, I think talking about patients' experiences in improving the quality of life, so talking about how will this affect my quality of life if I participate in a clinical trial, right? Because it does affect, like, in more ways than one can expect. It could disrupt their day-to-day work. It could mean that they have to travel distances to trial sites. It could mean that they might have side effects. So I think it's really important to consider that potential stress that a patient may have when they're committing to a trial, right? So and even if there might be no evidence of it being successful, but actually being vocal and open and actually telling them and building that trust. And I think that's sort of a very important point which Dr. Ban repeatedly stressed about, and even I think Dr. Bharat spoke about the trust factor. So I think it's really important that you have to build that patient's trust and ensure that there is no breach of that trust happening during the clinical trial, during the various steps. And I feel like they have to be reassured. Like, for me, like, I feel like if I'm asked to participate in a clinical trial, I need to be reassured that you have my best interest in mind, and you're not doing this for XYZ agenda. You're not doing it to I don't know, to benefit some pharma company. I don't know, like, there are so many also misconceptions and fears around generally the word clinical trial, right? So I think actually having almost like a conversation with patients about what this might mean, what could this actually result to, how they might be playing a role in developing something which could benefit a larger set of people. But also remembering that for that patient who's going through, the larger picture may not be visible. So helping them see that larger picture may actually change their mind in wanting to participate in it. So I think asking, if the patient would like to also include somebody else in the process, right? Can you, like, for example, can like a family member be involved in these conversations around the clinical trial? So and there is this, I really feel like removing that taboo around clinical trial, and where patients think that they're being used as guinea pigs. I think that is a fear factor that is there, and that needs to be broken. And I think that can only happen if you constantly engage with the patient community, talking to them, engaging with them, building that trust. Like Dr. Ban said, you have to. This is a long-term thing. It will not happen over time. That's for sure. And I think ensuring that their confidentiality, and privacy would be protected. I think that is really, really important for a lot of people now. And I think it's really important to sort of assure them that listen, like we will ensure that whatever information is being taken, it will be kept, the confidentiality will be maintained. So I think once a patient is, I feel like a patient will be more involved when they understand what are the different roles of the different people that are there in the clinical trial are, and what are the specific roles. And also, like, almost like actually asking them, asking patients, okay, how do you think we should design this better? What do you think can improve better? Where do you think we are lagging? Actually being open to critique, to helpful criticism, and taking inputs, I think will go a long way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Padma. So I think I'm going to summarize the perspectives from all four of you in the words which are recurring are trust, communicate, involve, and respect. So I think these can't be done separately, but it's a process, and it'll feed each other. So I think empowering clinicians in able to communicate well, communicate in simple language, and able to communicate the results is going to improve the trust. So having said this, there are certain questions which I would like to focus from the chat box, which probably we may not have immediate answers. How do we do this? It is so challenging. So the common question which we have is, isn't it too much to ask for clinicians to be involving patients? And what kind of cooperation will we get? How is there a standard protocol? Can we be guided by this? So I'll just start with some of my thoughts of what I feel. Do we have a standard protocol for this, or we make it? Now, this participation, or the challenges we face in participation, the challenges we might have in engagement, and the importance of engagement, and the rules of engagement, as well as how we involve, is very much specific to a particular context. While we can learn from developed nations, we need to have experiences, we have to move towards it to actually do this and experience and share the guidance as to how to do it. And in literature, there are several examples of how this has been done. But I think only by doing it and by stepping into this, we will be able to get this answer. Dr. KK was asking, is there a standard protocol? Yes, we have to develop one for our country, for our context. And in fact, even in our context, what works in critical care may not work in pediatric settings. It may not work in a community-based study. So I think we have to move towards step of making one, and each one of us are responsible for that. So I want to ask each of the panelists, starting from Dr. Bharat, having gone through this panel discussion, what do you think are your two suggestions of what a researcher should do going ahead? And I will move this to each of the panelists to summarize two important points which we think is a point to move ahead from here on this clinical trial stage. If we start thinking about this seriously, how should we go about it? From each one of us. Dr. Bharat, briefly.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Very quickly, I think the way forward involves engagement from several stakeholders. I think at a country level, we need to improve what I'm going to refer to as an ease of doing research index. We need to really move up this index if there is one. At the patient level, I think it's been well highlighted, right? We need awareness, but we need awareness that we need to create from the grassroots level. This means, for trials for community, trials at the hospital, at primary health centers, and patients need to be involved in every step in prioritizing the research questions, but also in designing, developing, all of that. I also think we need to engage clinicians, because clinicians, at least in the context in which I work, they act as a powerful interface to getting trials done. And they also, we spoke about this power imbalance, right? So the doctor that's managing the patient is central to that. So we need to engage them. They need to have education. They need to have training about, what is the importance of trials, and this needs to happen during medical school. There needs to be ongoing training on why this is important, how we need to communicate, because they need to buy in on this, on doing trials, and that means they need to move away from dogmas. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Aparna, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that, because in our setup of healthcare, the clinicians are the face, the interface between whatever system we have and the patient. So they are the ones who are best poised to send out this message. But for that, we actually need to train them. So now with our MCI courses, they have come up with, communication skills, and these things are being included in our undergraduate courses, which was very much needed. But I also think that when a person decides to become a researcher or embarks upon such trials, he or she does undergo some training from the sponsors or from the funders or from anywhere. So those trainings are basically very much oriented towards as to how to design, what analysis you do, and what your protocol will be. But those trainings should also have a big chunk in which they should tell the researchers as to how to engage the patient, how to be transparent, and what questions you may face. And you'll have to be there for the patient you have enrolled throughout the process of trials, and maybe beyond that, because it has to be a personal rapport that has to be developed. If needed, decentralize the trials more so that you have more interfaces, so that you can have more of that rapport. So that training needs to be very much in our curriculum, as well as in the assorted trainings that we do give before starting trials.
Very true, Dr. Aparna. Dr. Bhan, your thoughts, closing thoughts?
Sure. So, as the best clinician who understands these issues is a clinician who's been a patient. And this is something I recognized by my own experiences. I had a foot injury a few years ago, and I had to be operated on. So it was quite an experience being on the other side. In the way I was treated as a patient, in the way that I was consented on the operating table, but not, not told of the risk benefits before the operation, in the way that I was woken up every 3 hours for a BP and measurement, just basically not allowing me to rest. And this is something, as a clinician, you might tend to think is important because you think the best interest of the patient is paramount. But when you're on the other side, you realize that there are issues with the way you are talked down to, where your perspectives are not really center stage. And it is true that, everyone is struggling against time, especially in the public sector. But I think this is something, a lot of people have written about. Paul Kalani's, memoir, When Breath Becomes Air, when he speaks about being a neurosurgeon who's struggling with advanced lung cancer. He talks about the fact that when he became a data point himself, he realized what it meant, in the way we describe our studies, when we do all of these fancy presentations in conferences, and we talked about our sample sizes, each of that sample size data points is the real human being, right? And when we recognize that, and we speak to that, and we honor that by actually truly engaging with every person that we work with as a relevant stakeholder, that's the kind of difference we want to bring about. Because each of us at some point of time will have an intersection. Whether you're a clinician, the head of a funding institution, you will have to intersect, whether for yourself or for a loved one. And if you would like to be treated in a certain way in that setting, then of course you have to make that change from now. And so at each level, institutions, sponsors, funders, clinicians, all other stakeholders, we need to recognize that and start working on it. And if we truly believe in it, of course, that change can happen.
Totally agree, Dr. Bhan. Empathy is something which researchers should have. And Padma, your final take on this as advocates, as how people need to trust clinicians. It's not just I think there's a lot of burden on the clinician now, because everybody said, yes, clinician is the face, clinician has to do. But I would also say, as a clinician and a researcher, people have to trust, right? So we look forward for that. So how do you think, what could be the initial steps to get the trust about the researchers and the clinical trials?
Right. I think you saw me nodding my head a lot when Dr. Bhan was speaking. I think he put out really important points regarding empathy. But one other point that I really would like to bring, and again, this is from my own experience of the last 2 years of struggling with this long COVID, is I think clinicians need to have curiosity. And I know for the because it's been a very heavy 2 years for everybody in the medical field. I understand that everyone was overburdened. But I think having curiosity about what a patient is going through, why that patient is going through, almost actually putting on, the famous TV serial, the Dr. House hat almost, and actually looking at believing the patient. I think just starting with that, being curious, I think would lead to a lot of questions, which in turn would lead to more research and wanting to understand what is happening. I think what a lot of us in the community are experiencing right now is a lot of medical gaslighting. And I'm not just saying this for long COVID. I think there's, whether it's for a lot of chronic illnesses, also you see that there is a constant invalidation of patients that's happening. And I think that's honestly happening because of lack of curiosity and time. And I think that just needs to somehow, I don't know if that can be taught, but I do hope that at some point this aspect can be captured. And I think, maybe in the undergrad courses, sort of pushing them to think a bit outside the box. What could it be? And another thing, honestly, is actually think of your patient as someone who is equal, and don't talk down to them. Like, talk to them. Like, don't think that they don't understand what is happening. I mean, we know what is happening with our body, and I think just trusting your patient will go a long way in the patient trusting you. If I trust the doctor who's currently treating me, it's because this doctor heard me out. This doctor is open to what might be happening to me. This doctor is curious to what could be causing it. So I think while the burden is a lot on the clinician, it's also because the clinician is taking on the burden. And a lot of it can be eliminated if you choose to trust the patient and choose to sort of understand what's happening.
Yes, Doctor. Yes, Padma. So thank you very much. And I think I see the relationship between relationships between researchers and public is like a marriage: trust, respect, empathy, and believe in each other. So I think with this we'll close the discussion, and thank you very much. I think the two questions which from the panel, which was how do we do this, is something, yes, we have to start thinking about it, and we have to do this, and it's important. I think that's an important message I would want to pass on this special day. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Bhan, Dr. Aparna, Dr. Bharat, and Padma, and look forward. And this is not just one-off event. I think we'll really look forward to do something, and by next year we should have something as a guidance and some experience in involving and engaging